This story happened to me a few years ago, but I still can't get rid of the creepy feeling that something was left unfinished. I didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but what happened changed my worldview forever. Back then, I was working as a photographer and often looked for abandoned places for my shoots. Once, at the end of October, I came across an old psychiatric hospital, which was located deep in the forest. The place was long abandoned, overgrown with bushes, and almost merged with the surrounding nature. Few people knew about it, and that made it more interesting for me. I decided to go there at night to capture this place in its darkest and most mysterious setting. That evening, the weather was overcast. A light rain drizzled from the sky, which added a special atmosphere. I took only a camera and a flashlight with me, believing that nothing else would be needed. When I got to the hospital, I had a strange feeling as if I wasn't alone, but I put it down to nerves and got carried away looking for good angles. An ominous silence reigned inside the building. The walls were covered with mold, floors creaked underfoot, and the windows, where there was still glass, cracked or boarded up. Everything here suggested that the place had been abandoned for a long time, and at the same time it gave the impression that it was breathing, living its dark, hidden life. I kept taking pictures, trying to capture the very dark, ominous atmosphere I was looking for. The deeper I went into the building, the more anxious I became. The light of the flashlight picked out mosaic tiles on the floor, peeling paint on the walls, remnants of old furniture. All this seemed frozen in a time-forgotten void. When I entered one of the corridors, something strange happened. At first I heard a faint, barely perceptible sound, as if someone was scratching on the wall. I stopped listening, but everything was quiet again. I thought it might be the sound of the wind or an old tree, and went on. But then the sound came again, louder and closer this time. It seemed that someone or something was slowly approaching me. My heart started pounding wildly, but I convinced myself that it was just nerves. I kept moving forward, even though every cell in my body was screaming for me to turn around and leave. At some point, I heard a faint child's laughter, so gentle and serene that it could not belong to this gloomy place. It was so unexpected that I flinched and dropped the flashlight. When I picked it up and turned it on again, I noticed that the walls and floors began to become covered with wet spots, as if water was oozing out of them. The smell of dampness and mold intensified, and the air became thick, suffocating. I turned the corner and saw the open door of one of the wards. The strange feeling that someone was there did not leave me. I turned the light on there and saw that the room was empty except for an old iron bed that stood in the middle of the room. But something on that bed made me stop. There was a doll lying on a dirty, torn mattress. She was old, with a darkened face and tangled hair. The scariest thing was that her eyes were directed directly at me, as if she was watching my every move. Without realizing what I was doing, I picked up the camera and took a picture. At that moment, I felt something cold touch my hand. Turning sharply, I saw no one, but the feeling of an icy touch did not disappear. It was too real to be just a figment of my imagination. I took a few steps back and the door of the ward slammed shut. The sound was so loud that my ears rang. Panic was building inside me, but I was still trying to control myself. I headed back to the exit, but as I approached the door leading to the stairs, the flashlight blinked again and went out. When I was in total darkness, I froze. My hand was shaking, trying to find the flashlight button, but it didn't react. The silence around them was oppressive, as if the whole building was frozen in anticipation. I stood holding my breath, listening to every sound. Thoughts flashed through my head that it was just the technique that failed, that I would now turn on the flashlight and everything would be normal again. But the horror was growing inside me, slowly and inexorably. Suddenly, in the pitch darkness, I heard a soft, scratching sound behind me. It wasn't the kind of noise that I could explain by the wind or an old building. The sound was clear and directional, as if someone was driving something sharp against the wall. My heart was pounding even harder, and I could hardly breathe. That sound, scratchy cold, came closer, and I realized that someone or something was standing right behind me. I felt an icy horror that gripped me from head to toe. Without thinking, I rushed forward, hoping to find a wall, a railing, anything to find a way out. In the dark, my hands came across something hard and cold, a door. I pushed her hard, but she wouldn't budge. I started punching her, screaming, trying to break her down, but she wouldn't move. Despair overwhelmed me, and I suddenly felt someone's cold fingers slowly touching my neck. It was unbearable. I turned to throw away this darkness, this nightmare. But I didn't see anything. Nevertheless, I knew for sure that I was not alone. It was too real. I tried to control myself, not to panic, but I didn't have the strength. The screams stuck in my throat, and I felt something cold and wet wrap around my leg, as if pulling it out from under me. The feeling of cold, wet hands on my leg was so real that it felt like my veins were frozen in place. At some point, I thought I was crazy, that it was just a figment of my overactive imagination, caused by fear and adrenaline, but the mind refused to believe it. An inner voice screamed that all this was real, that I was really in mortal danger. I began to frantically try to free myself, but my feet seemed rooted to the floor. Panic overwhelmed me with renewed vigor. I tried to hold my consciousness, desperately clutching at the memories of who I was, where I was, and that all this could only be a terrible dream. However, a sticky, creepy reality surrounded me from all sides. Feeling that an invisible entity was pulling the life out of me did not let go. I hit the door again, this time with my elbows and shoulders, but it remained in place as if the whole weight of the world was leaning on it from the other side. My punches were getting weaker, but I didn't give up. At some point, I felt my movements slow down, and I stopped feeling my own limbs. This feeling paralyzed me to the core. Soon I stopped feeling not only my legs, but also my arms. My body seemed to refuse to obey me. At some point, I noticed that everything was completely quiet around me. It wasn't just silence, it was a complete absence of sounds, as if the world had ceased to exist. Even the sound of my breathing, which had been so loud a moment ago, was gone. Couldn't hear anything but my own inner voice, which screamed silently in horror. The most horrific scenarios began to play out in my head. I remembered stories about people disappearing in places like this, about how their bodies were found after many years, tortured and mutilated, and it suddenly became clear to me that I could become one of them. My story could end here, in this damn building that swallows up everyone who comes in here. At some point, when I had almost lost hope, my hand felt something cold and hard on the door. It was a handle. How did I not notice her before? Pressed on it, but the lock was so rusty that it wouldn't budge. I exerted all the strength I still had, feeling the sweat on my hands. Finally, after a few agonizing seconds that seemed like an eternity, Castle gave up. The door opened with a loud creak, and without hesitation, I jumped out into the corridor. But if I thought this was the end of the nightmare, I was wrong. The hallway was as dark as the room I had just escaped from. There was the same suffocating smell of rot and dampness all around, and for a moment it seemed to me that I was trapped again. The flashlight, which miraculously worked again, picked out walls from the darkness, stripped and stained with mold. But now I knew one thing. I had a chance to escape, and I wasn't going to miss it. I moved forward, trying to ignore the heaviness in my legs and the foggy consciousness. I no longer felt like I was stepping on the floor, like I was breathing, like my heart was beating. All that was important was to move forward, while there was at least some hope of getting out of this hell. Corridors seemed endless. As I walked, the walls seemed to shrink around me, as if they were trying to pull me back into that creepy room. The screeching sound appeared again. Now it was coming from somewhere above, as if someone was scratching the ceiling right above my head. I didn't want to look up for fear of seeing something that would break my mind. Curiosity was stronger. I picked up the flashlight and froze for a moment. There were scratches on the ceiling, deep, as if they had been left by claws. The scariest thing was that they were following me, exactly following my route. At that moment, I felt that something invisible and inexorable was watching me, playing with me like a cat with a mouse, teasing, torturing, but not killing. It wanted me to experience this horror, feel the hopelessness of my situation. I tried to ignore this terrible fact and quickened my pace. One question was spinning in my head. What is it? Why me? But there were no answers. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't stop. At some point, I realized that I was no longer running, but practically crawling along this dark, ominous corridor that seemed to never end. But suddenly, the light of a flashlight picked out something from the darkness that made me stop. At the end of the corridor, where there should have been another door, stood a dark figure. She was motionless, but I knew for sure that she could see me. My heart literally stopped when I realized that the path to salvation was blocked. This shadow, this vague silhouette, seemed to be the living embodiment of all my horror. She didn't move, but I could feel her getting closer, her presence becoming more and more tangible. I froze in place, unable to take a single step. It seemed like time had stopped, and I was standing there frozen, looking at this ghost. What was I supposed to do? To go back means to find myself back in the dark room that almost became my grave. To continue the journey means to come face to face with this creepy creature, which carried something truly sinister. Taking a convulsive step back, I realized that my whole body refused to obey me. Fear held me down so much that my muscles couldn't move. The figure in front of me still remained motionless, but I could feel its energy filling the corridor, suffocating me, pulling out the last of my strength. I realized that I had only one chance left. Screaming with the last of my strength, I rushed to the side, trying to break past this entity. I ran as fast as I could, feeling every step getting harder as the darkness around me became denser. And then something unimaginable happened. I felt someone grab my arm. The hand was cold, like ice, and incredibly strong. I tried to pull away, but the grip was iron. It was as if time had slowed down, and I felt my strength leaving me. My chest was constricted. It became almost impossible to breathe. It was at that moment when I felt my strength leaving me that I heard a sound. It was not a scream or a whisper, but a clear, deliberate and clear voice. It was a real human voice. "Hold on, I'm here," this voice shouted. It was full of determination and rigor, which seemed incredibly familiar to me. I immediately realized that this was not just a figment of my imagination. The scream came from somewhere around the corner, from a shadow that I hadn't lit up yet. Pushing the last of the air out of my chest with difficulty, I continued to struggle with this icy grip. My chest continued to squeeze. The sound of the voice, insistent and loud, became an anchor for me, which kept me on the verge between consciousness and unconsciousness. I could feel my body weakening, but at the same time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I tried my best to pull away again, reaching for that voice, trying to imagine that he was my savior. And then I felt the grip begin to loosen. That cold hand, which seemed treacherous and powerful, became less intense. Maybe it was the effect of sudden hope. Maybe my saving voice was some kind of magical source of power. Suddenly I heard the door in the hallway open with a bang. And in that sound, I heard new footsteps. My eyes were already getting used to the darkness, and I made out a figure entering the hallway. It was a man dressed in a work uniform and with a flashlight that illuminated his face. He was not young, with deep wrinkles and hard eyes, but there was a gleam of determination in his eyes. It was a firefighter or a security guard, someone who clearly knew how to deal with difficulty. "Hold on," he shouted again, breaking through the darkness and, as it seemed to me, overcoming all obstacles on the way. He came up to me, and I felt the arms around my leg weaken completely and disappear. The man grabbed my arm and wasted no time pulling me towards him. When he grabbed my arm, he used his strength to lead me out of this corridor. We were moving forward quickly, but every step is getting harder for me. My legs seemed paralyzed, and my strength was failing me. He supported me despite my weakness, and every step he took was full of confidence. It seemed that the way to the exit was a long one, but I no longer paid attention to the details. All I wanted to do was get out of this place and see the light. I prayed for help in my mind, and this man became the embodiment of my hope. Finally, we found ourselves on the street. It was raining outside, but this rain was a blessing for me. It was a sign that I was out of hell. The man left me at his car and called the emergency service. I remember getting into the car with difficulty and feeling how incredibly hard it was getting for me. The man, without even waiting for rescuers, sat next to me, monitored my condition, and supported me with words full of sympathy and understanding. "Are you okay, kid? Just hold on a bit. The medics are on their way," he said. trying to keep my spirits up as much as possible. I never found out who exactly saved me, but it didn't matter. For me, this man was a real hero. When the rescuers arrived, they quickly examined me and provided first aid. I was exhausted, but alive. Each of them was surprised how I could survive such a terrible situation. After that terrifying experience, I couldn't come to my senses for a long time, and this man, a stranger, helped me get through it. I will never forget his help, determination, and his courage. After a while, I found out that he was a security guard working in the area and that he was often sent to inspect abandoned buildings. That night has remained in my memory as the scariest and most incredible experience of my life. The place where I had experienced the nightmare continued to stand there as a monument to my fear and my salvation. And although I never found out what really happened in this place, I now know one thing: human help and courage can break even the darkest chains of horror.